The agreement was simple, clinical, and written on 2 pages that a lawyer had drafted in 40 minutes. Elena Vasquez would attend 12 social functions over the course of 9 months as the companion of Daniel Hargrove. She would be introduced as his partner. She would not contradict this in public. She would dress appropriately for each occasion, conduct herself with composure, and ask no personal questions that went beyond the boundaries of professional necessity. In return, Daniel Hargrove would pay her $4,000 a month, cover all expenses related to her appearances, and provide her with access to his personal kitchen 3 mornings a week so she could develop the menu for the restaurant. She had been trying to open for 6 years. Elena had read the agreement twice, sitting across from Daniel's lawyer in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and she had signed it without letting her hand shake, because she had promised herself she would not let her hand shake. She was 34 years old. She had been cooking professionally since she was 19. She had staged in 3 restaurants that had since earned Michelin stars, had run the kitchen of a well-regarded bistro in Portland for 4 years before it closed, not because of anything she did, but because the owner had made financial decisions that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with bad judgment. She had a gift that people who understood food recognized immediately and completely. She also had $47,000 in debt, a studio apartment with a radiator that worked when it wanted to, and a business plan for her restaurant that had been rejected by 9 different investors in the past 2 years because she didn't have the collateral, the connections, or the particular kind of confidence that came from never having had to worry about money. Daniel Hargrove had more money than Elena could meaningfully imagine. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that might have been handsome in a conventional way if it ever arranged itself into an expression that invited anything. It didn't. His face was the face of a man who had decided, at some specific point that Elena could not identify, that the world was something to be managed rather than experienced. He ran a commercial real estate firm that operated in 8 states. He lived alone in a house in Chestnut Hill that had 7 bedrooms and a kitchen that cost more than most restaurants and was used approximately 4 times a year. His wife Carolyn had died 22 months ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, which by the standards of that particular disease was not long, and by the standards of a marriage that had lasted 19 years was not long either. He had not dated since. He had not, as far as Elena could observe in the first weeks of their arrangement, done much of anything that was not work. He woke early. He worked late. He attended the social functions that his position required and stood at them with a glass of wine he rarely finished and spoke to people with the practiced fluency of a man who had learned to perform presence without actually being present. Elena attended the first 3 functions and played her role without difficulty. She was warm where he was contained. She laughed at the right moments. She touched his arm once when a business associate made a joke that required the physical language of a couple, and she felt him go very slightly, still beneath her hand, not flinching exactly, just registering, the way a person registers unexpected contact when they have been alone long enough that touch has become theoretical. She used the kitchen on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, arriving at 7 and leaving by noon, and those 5 hours were the truest part of her week. The kitchen was extraordinary. 6 burners, a full convection oven, a cold room, counter space she had never had in any professional kitchen she'd worked in. She treated it with the particular reverence she had always had for good kitchens, which was the reverence of someone who understood that a kitchen was not a room but a relationship. Daniel was always gone by the time she arrived. She knew this because his coffee cup was rinsed and upside down on the drying rack, and his briefcase was not by the door. She knew the rhythm of his mornings, the way you learn the rhythm of a space when you spend enough time in it, the particular silence of a house that has been empty for hours versus the particular silence of a house where someone is simply in another room. Except one Thursday in February, he wasn't gone. She came in at 7 and found him at the kitchen island, in a gray sweater and dark trousers, not dressed for the office, with a cup of coffee and an open laptop he wasn't looking at. He looked up when she came in, and there was a half-second of something on his face that might have been embarrassment, might have been relief before it arranged itself back into its usual composure. "I have calls from home today," he said. "I'll stay out of your way." "You don't have to stay out of your way," she said. "It's your kitchen." He stayed. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. He worked at the island with his laptop and his calls, and she worked at the stove and the counter, and they existed in the same space with the particular ease of two people who were both comfortable with silence for their own separate reasons. She was making a lamb ragu that she'd been developing for the restaurant menu, slow and careful, building it in layers the way good braises are built, and after about an hour she became aware that he had stopped typing. She glanced over. He was watching her cook, not in a strange way, in the way that people watch something that they find genuinely absorbing without having expected to. "My wife used to say that watching someone cook who really knows what they're doing is the closest thing to meditation she'd found," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned Caroline without being prompted, without context, without the careful neutrality he usually deployed when her name came up in social situations. He said it simply, like a fact that had surfaced without permission. Elena didn't make a thing of it. She was right, she said, and turned back to her ragu. But something had shifted slightly in the architecture of the arrangement. Over the following weeks it happened more often. He would work from home on a Thursday, or he would come home early on a Saturday, and she would be in the kitchen, and they would exist in that same comfortable parallel quiet. He started asking questions, not personal ones, not at first, but questions about food. Why she added the wine before the stock. What the difference was between a braise and a stew at the level of technique rather than just convention. What she was trying to do with a dish rather than just what she was making. And she answered him honestly, with the directness she always had when talking about cooking, because food was the one place where she had never learned to be anything other than completely herself. He started eating what she made. This had not been part of the agreement. She cooked for the menu development, tasted for seasoning and balance, and packaged what was left to take home. But one Saturday in March, she had made a potato and leek soup that she'd portioned into a bowl to taste, and he had come into the kitchen and looked at it, and she had said without thinking, "There's more in the pot," and he had poured himself a bowl and sat at the island and eaten it with the focused quiet of a man who had forgotten, temporarily, to be defended. "This is the best thing I've eaten in 2 years, he said. She almost asked why 2 years specifically, and then she didn't because she knew why. The months moved, the functions continued. They stood together at dinner, parties and charity events and industry gatherings and played their roles with the smoothness of long practice. And somewhere between the playing of the role and the Thursday mornings in the kitchen, Elena stopped being completely sure where one ended and the other began. She noticed things about him that she hadn't expected to notice. The way he listened, completely, without the half-distracted quality of most people who were simply waiting for their turn to speak. The way he treated people who served him at events, always direct, always courteous, always with the specific quality of attention that meant he actually saw them. The way he sometimes stood at the window in the kitchen when he thought she wasn't looking at him and looked out at the garden that Caroline had planted, and which he paid someone to maintain, exactly as she had left it. She noticed that he was not a man without feeling. He was a man who had put his feeling somewhere very deep and locked it, and was now living on the surface of himself because the depths had become too dangerous. She understood this more than she had expected to. In April, her investor came through. Not because of Daniel, not directly. A woman she'd cooked for at one of the events, a restaurant group owner named Patricia Huang, had called her 3 weeks after a dinner party and said she'd been thinking about the way Elena had described her menu concept and she wanted to hear more. They had met twice. A term sheet was on Elena's table. The restaurant was real. Suddenly, in a way it had only ever been in her head and her business plan and the recipes she developed on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday mornings in Daniel Hargrove's kitchen. The 9 months ended on a Friday in June. She had known this was coming. She had the date written in her phone with no label. Just the date, the way you mark. Something you need to prepare for without wanting to look at it directly. She had planned to cook that last Saturday morning. Leave the kitchen as she'd always left it. Clean. Organized exactly as she found it. And go. No ceremony. The agreement had been professional. The ending would be professional. But on that Friday evening, something happened that she had not planned. She was in the kitchen at 6 in the evening, later than she'd ever stayed, because she had decided without fully deciding that she needed to cook. Something real. Not for the menu, not for the restaurant, just something real. She had gone to the market that afternoon and bought things she hadn't bought in years, things her grandmother had taught her to cook with. And she had come back to this kitchen that had become the most important room in her recent life, and she had started cooking the way she cooked, when she was not trying to impress anyone or develop anything or prove anything. She made her grandmother's arroz con pollo, slow and full of saffron and green olives and the particular depth that only comes from cooking with love as an actual ingredient, not as a metaphor. She made it the way it was meant to be made, without shortcuts, with the patience of someone who understood that some things cannot be rushed without being destroyed. Daniel came home at 7 to find his house smelling like a home. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with his jacket over his arm and looked at her at the stove, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything immediately. "The agreement ends tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to cook something real before I left." He set his jacket on the chair and came to the island and sat down, and she finished the dish and plated it without performance, just the care she always gave to food, and she set it in front of him and sat across from him with her own plate. He ate in silence for a long time. She watched his face without meaning to. She saw the moment it happened, the moment the food went past hunger, past taste, into something older and deeper. She saw his jaw work once in a way that had nothing to do with chewing. She saw him set his fork down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands need to do something other than hold an object. He looked at her. "Caroline used to say that I was someone who needed to be cooked. For to feel loved," he said. She said, "I didn't know how to receive love in words, that I needed someone to make something with their hands and put it in front of me before I could actually feel it." He stopped. She was right. She was right about most things. Another stop, longer. "I have been so careful for 2 years. So careful not to feel anything beyond what I could manage. And you have been in my kitchen for 9 months. And I have been watching you care about things, about the food, about the details, about the way one ingredient has to be treated with respect before you add the next one. And I have been standing next to something real for 9 months and telling myself it was an arrangement." He looked at her with the look of a man who has just stopped pretending completely for the first time in 2 years. And the look was not polished or composed or managed. It was just honest, raw and quiet and completely honest. "I don't want the arrangement to end tomorrow." Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at her plate. She looked at his face. "It already ended," she said softly. "Somewhere around February." She met his eyes. "I just didn't know what to do with that." Outside the window, the garden that Caroline had planted was lit by the last of the evening light, the roses she had chosen coming into their early summer bloom, and the kitchen was warm with saffron and broth and the smell of something made with time and care and the specific tenderness of a person who understood that cooking was never really about food. It was always about what you were willing to give. Daniel Hargrove reached across the island and put his hand over Elena's hand, and she turned her palm up and let him, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because everything that needed to be said had already been said, not in words, but in 9 months of Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday mornings, in questions about technique and answers given without armor, in bowls of soup, eaten in silence, and a final plate of arroz con pollo that had crossed the last careful distance between two people who had both been alone long enough and had finally, on a Friday evening in June, decided that they were done.